The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and faint wisps of incense. Dim light spilled from the brass oil lamps mounted on the towering stone walls, their flames casting jittery shadows that danced like restless phantoms. The silence of the great library was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of a turning page or the distant drip of water seeping through ancient cracks. Erasmus felt his breath catch as he stepped deeper into the heart of the library. The sensation of eyes watching him from the darkened alcoves sent a shiver up his spine. His fingers grazed the edge of a wooden shelf, its surface polished smooth from centuries of touch, yet cold as a tombstone beneath his fingertips. Scrolls and tomes lined the walls in chaotic elegance, a maze of knowledge that seemed alive, pulsing with secrets too vast to comprehend. He clutched the brass key in his pocket, its sharp edges pressing into his palm like a quiet warning. The old curator had been cryptic, almost reluctant, when he handed it over. Some doors should remain locked, the man had muttered, his cloudy eyes avoiding Erasmus's gaze. But Erasmus had insisted, driven by whispers of a hidden chamber buried beneath the library, a chamber said to house treasures far beyond gold or jewels. His boots echoed against the marble floor as he reached a staircase spiraling downward, its banister worn smooth with time. The air grew heavier with each step, the temperature dropping as though he were descending into the belly of the earth. A faint hum began to vibrate through the stones, a sound so low it was more felt than heard. It seemed to crawl into his chest, wrapping around his ribs like invisible tendrils. The door stood before him now, its surface blackened with age and scarred by what looked like claw marks. Symbols carved into the wood glinted faintly in the flickering lamplight, their edges sharp and alien, as though they had been etched by something not entirely human. Erasmus hesitated, the weight of the keys suddenly unbearable in his hand. The whispers had grown louder now, though there was no one around to speak them. They coiled through the air, a chaotic symphony of voices layered over each other, speaking languages he did not understand but somehow felt deep within his bones. He slid the key into the lock, the metal groaning as it turned. The whispers stopped. The silence was absolute, pressing against his ears like the roar of a vacuum. The door creaked open, revealing a chamber bathed in a pale, unnatural glow. Erasmus stepped inside, his breath hitching as the glow illuminated what lay within. The walls were covered in massive shelves, but the books and scrolls seemed to pulse, their surfaces writhing as though alive. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a single book. Its cover was bound in what appeared to be flesh, stitched together with threads that shimmered like spider silk. The letters on the cover were not written but seemed to shift and reform before his eyes, defying comprehension. A wave of nausea struck him as he approached, the air in the chamber thick with the smell of decay and something metallic, like blood. He reached out, his hand trembling, drawn to the book despite every instinct screaming at him to stop. As his fingers brushed the surface, a searing heat shot up his arm, and the whispers returned, this time deafening, their words piercing his mind like shards of glass. The room seemed to twist, the shelves closing in, their contents spilling onto the floor in a cascade of ancient texts and writhing shadows. Erasmus fell to his knees, clutching his head as the glow intensified, the voices rising to a crescendo that drowned out his own scream. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The room was still. The book was gone. But Erasmus knew something had been left behind, something that now moved within him. Erasmus staggered to his feet, his knees weak and his breaths ragged. The chamber around him was eerily still, as if frozen in time. The oppressive glow that had filled the room moments before had vanished, leaving only the dim light of his lantern to flicker against the cold, stone walls. His trembling hands reached for the pedestal, now empty, its surface scorched as though the book had burned itself into the stone. The whispers had gone silent, yet their echo lingered in his mind, faint and haunting, like a melody that refused to fade. He glanced down at his hand, the one that had touched the book. The skin was red and blistered, veins darkened and spidering out from his fingertips. A sharp, searing pain coursed through his arm, making him bite down on his lip to stifle a groan. He stumbled backward, his shoulder brushing against one of the shelves. The books tumbled to the floor, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw them move, writhing as though alive. But when he blinked, they were still. "Get out," he whispered to himself, his voice shaking. "Just get out." His footsteps echoed hollowly as he made his way toward the door, but something felt wrong. The air in the chamber seemed thicker now, heavier, as though it were resisting his movements. The door loomed ahead, its blackened surface beckoning him, yet it felt impossibly far away. Behind him, a soft rustling sound began to grow. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination, but it grew louder, more deliberate, like pages turning rapidly in a quiet room. He spun around, his lantern trembling in his grip. The shelves were moving. The books and scrolls shifted, their covers undulating as though breathing. A low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, not quite human, not quite animal, a sound that raised every hair on his body. Erasmus backed away, his legs trembling. "Stay away," he muttered, though he wasn't sure who, or what, he was speaking to. Suddenly, the rustling ceased. The silence was deafening, pressing against his eardrums like a tangible force. And then, from the shadows, something emerged. It wasn't a figure or a creature, not in any conventional sense. It was a shape, shifting, amorphous, its edges flickering like the static of a failing signal. Eyes formed and dissolved within it, countless and unblinking, their gaze piercing through him. Erasmus stumbled backward, his back hitting the door with a force that rattled the ancient wood. The shape moved closer, its presence oppressive, filling the chamber with an energy that seemed to sap the air from his lungs. He fumbled for the door handle, his fingers slipping against the cold metal. The shape paused mere inches from him, its countless eyes boring into his soul. A single voice, deep and resonant, echoed in his mind. "You opened the door," it said, each word reverberating through his skull. "You are the vessel now." Before he could scream, the shape surged forward, engulfing him in an instant. The chamber was plunged into darkness, and the lantern clattered to the floor, its flame extinguished. When the light returned, Erasmus was gone. But the chamber wasn't empty. The pedestal now held the book once more, its flesh-bound cover unscathed, its letters shifting and shimmering. And from somewhere deep within the library, the whispers began anew. The whispers twisted through the great library like a cold wind, slithering into every crevice and corridor. Far above the hidden chamber, the main hall of the library remained undisturbed, its towering shelves a monument to centuries of knowledge. The flickering oil lamps cast long, eerie shadows across the floor, and the faint scent of incense still lingered in the air. But something was different now. The silence wasn't serene, it was oppressive, laden with an unseen weight that pressed down on anyone who lingered too long. Kasia, the library's junior archivist, paused as she wheeled a cart of scrolls through the vast, labyrinthine aisles. She felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, like the library itself was holding its breath. Her steps faltered as a sudden chill prickled her skin, raising goosebumps on her arms. The torches along the walls flickered violently, their flames sputtering as if struggling against an unseen force. Kasia stopped in her tracks, gripping the handle of the cart tightly. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing faintly in the vast expanse. No response. Only the whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder, layering over one another until they seemed to come from every direction. She spun around, her heart pounding. The whispers weren't words, they were something else, something primal, something that burrowed into her mind and refused to let go. Kasia stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of a carpet. She fell to the ground, the impact jarring her and scattering scrolls across the floor. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A shadow that didn't belong to anything in the room. It slithered along the wall, its shape unnatural, defying the angles and curves of the architecture. The whispering grew louder as the shadow expanded, stretching across the floor like spilled ink. Kasia scrambled to her feet, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The air around her seemed to thrum with energy, a vibration that resonated in her chest and rattled her teeth. The shadow moved closer, its edges flickering like the static of a dying signal. She turned to run, but the shelves seemed to shift around her, closing in, the aisles narrowing into a suffocating maze. Books tumbled from their places, hitting the ground with heavy thuds, their pages fluttering as if alive. From deep within the darkness, a voice emerged, deep, resonant, and inhuman. It spoke her name. Kasia. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the very stones of the library. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees. The shadow loomed over her now, its form vast and incomprehensible, shifting and pulsating with a malevolent life of its own. "Where is he?" the voice demanded, each word striking her like a physical blow. "Where is the one who opened the door?" Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about." The shadow quivered, its countless eyes blinking into existence, each one boring into her with unbearable intensity. "You will," the voice said, its tone filled with dark certainty. The shadow surged forward, engulfing her in cold, suffocating darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The library was silent once more, the shelves still, the air heavy with the scent of parchment and dust. But Kasia was no longer alone. From the darkness, something ancient and unspeakable had awakened, and it had begun to spread. The great library seemed to hold its breath in the aftermath, the silence now a living thing, thick and cloying. Kasia sat motionless on the cold marble floor, her trembling hands clutching at her chest as if to steady the erratic thrum of her heart. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing against her, seeping into her skin. Her mind raced, replaying the voice, the shifting eyes, the unspoken dread that had consumed her. She glanced down at her arms, and her breath caught in her throat. Black veins snaked their way up from her fingertips, writhing beneath her skin like living tendrils. She tried to scream, but her voice came out as a strangled gasp. The books around her lay scattered, their pages torn and fluttering as if caught in an unseen breeze. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was worse, unnatural, charged with an energy that set her teeth on edge. She needed to move, needed to get out of the library, but her body felt heavy, as if weighted down by the same darkness that had enveloped her. Summoning every ounce of strength, she staggered to her feet, clutching at the edge of a nearby shelf for support. The room seemed to tilt and sway, the once familiar architecture warping into something alien. The air was colder now, each breath fogging as it left her lips. She took a step forward, then another, her legs trembling beneath her. The doorway was ahead, but it felt impossibly far away, as though the library itself were conspiring to keep her trapped. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back at her in distorted, fragmented tones. As she reached the threshold, a low groan reverberated through the walls, the sound like the grinding of stone against stone. She froze, turning back toward the main hall. The shelves were moving again, their heavy wooden frames creaking as they shifted and rearranged themselves. At the far end of the hall, a figure stood in the shadows. It was indistinct at first, a blur of darkness against the dim light. But as it moved closer, its features became clearer, gaunt, hollow eyes sunken into a face that looked both ancient and decayed. It wasn't Erasmus. At least, not anymore. His skin was pale, almost translucent, veins blackened and pulsing beneath the surface. His lips parted, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged, and a voice that was not his own spilled forth. "You shouldn't have come here," the thing wearing Erasmus's face said, its words dripping with malice. Kasia stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. "Erasmus," she whispered, though she already knew the answer. The figure tilted its head, a grotesque smile spreading across its face. "Erasmus is gone," it said, stepping closer. "With every door, there is a price. And now, you will pay it." Kasia turned and ran, her boots slipping on the polished marble as she bolted toward the exit. The shadows seemed to follow her, coiling around her feet, reaching for her like grasping hands. She burst through the library's grand doors and into the night, the cool air hitting her like a slap. But the sense of safety was fleeting. Behind her, the library loomed, its windows glowing faintly with an unnatural light. And from within, the whispers began again, louder now, spilling out into the darkness. Kasia didn't look back. But she knew the library wasn't done with her. And whatever had been unleashed within those ancient walls was no longer confined to its depths. Kasia ran through the deserted streets of the city, her breaths coming in sharp, ragged bursts. The cobblestones beneath her feet were slick with rain, and the chill of the night bit at her skin. She clutched her arms tightly, trying to ignore the dark veins crawling up her hands, spreading further with each passing moment. The whispers weren't just in the library anymore, they were in her head, a constant murmur of voices that made it hard to think, hard to focus. They spoke in fragments, in languages she didn't understand but somehow felt she should. She turned a corner, nearly colliding with a wooden cart left abandoned in the street. The city was unusually quiet, its usual bustling energy replaced by an eerie stillness. Windows were shuttered, and lanterns flickered weakly as though the light itself was being drained. Kasia's mind reeled, her thoughts spiraling back to the shadow, to Erasmus, no, to whatever he had become. The memory of his hollow eyes, the jagged grin that wasn't his, sent a shiver through her body. She needed help. She needed answers. Her feet carried her instinctively toward the one place that might provide them, the home of the curator. He had always been a mysterious figure, guarding the secrets of the library with an almost obsessive zeal. But now, she understood why. The whispers told her he knew. He had always known. The narrow alley leading to his house was cloaked in darkness, the lamplight failing to penetrate its depths. Kasia hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to run. But where could she go? She forced herself forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the old, weathered door. Her knuckles rapped against the wood, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, from within, came the sound of shuffling footsteps. The door creaked open just enough for her to see the curator's face, pale and lined with age. His eyes widened as he saw her, darting to the black veins on her hands. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You opened it. You touched it." Kasia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know. I didn't know what it was." The curator's expression darkened, and he pulled her inside, bolting the door behind her. The room was cluttered with books, maps, and artifacts, every surface covered with relics of a time long forgotten. "You've doomed us all," he said, his voice heavy with despair. Kasia recoiled at his words, her back pressing against the wall. "There has to be a way to stop this," she pleaded. "There has to be a way to fix it." The curator shook his head, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "You don't understand. The book isn't just a relic. It's alive. It feeds on those who touch it, who open the door. And now—" He trailed off, his gaze falling to the dark veins creeping up her arms. Kasia followed his eyes, her stomach twisting with fear. "And now what?" she whispered. He looked at her, his face grave. "And now, it's inside you." Before she could respond, the whispers surged in her mind, louder than ever, drowning out everything else. She clutched her head, sinking to her knees as the room seemed to spin around her. The curator knelt beside her, his voice distant and muffled. "You have to fight it. If it takes you, it will spread. It will consume everything." His words barely registered as the whispers filled her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the void. And in the shadows of the room, something began to move. The shadows in the curator's room shifted unnaturally, coiling like smoke but with a weight and presence that defied explanation. Kasia writhed on the floor, her hands clawing at her temples as the whispers grew deafening, each voice overlapping, each word a key unlocking something buried deep inside her. The curator scrambled to his feet, frantically searching through the cluttered room. He pulled ancient scrolls from shelves, tossed open brittle books, and scattered dusty relics across the floor in his desperation. "There's still time," he muttered, though his voice trembled with doubt. "There has to be." Kasia's vision blurred, the room twisting into a kaleidoscope of light and shadow. She could feel it now, the presence inside her. It wasn't just in her mind, it was in her veins, her muscles, her very soul. It whispered promises of power, of knowledge, of freedom from fear. But beneath the seductive words was something darker, hungrier, a force that wanted to consume her entirely. The curator rushed back to her side, holding a small, jagged dagger that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Its blade was inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift when she looked at them, ancient and incomprehensible. "This blade can sever its hold on you," he said, his voice urgent. "But you have to let me." Before he could finish, the shadows surged forward, crashing into him like a wave. He was flung across the room, hitting a shelf with a sickening crack. Books and artifacts rained down around him as he slumped to the floor, motionless. Kasia tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as the shadows coalesced into a form, a towering, amorphous figure that radiated malice. Its eyes, countless and ever-shifting, bore into her, pinning her in place. "You are mine now," the entity said, its voice a cacophony of tones that resonated through her entire being. Kasia's body convulsed as the dark veins spread further, creeping up her neck and toward her face. She could feel herself slipping away, her thoughts drowned out by the whispers, her identity unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. But in the chaos, a faint memory surfaced, Erasmus's face, his wide-eyed terror as he spoke of the book. His final words echoed in her mind, "The door, it can't stay open." Her eyes snapped to the dagger lying on the floor, just inches from her trembling hand. The whispers screamed in protest as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The entity lunged toward her, its form distorting, filling the room with an oppressive, suffocating darkness. With a surge of will she didn't know she possessed, Kasia gripped the dagger and drove it into her own arm, piercing the darkest vein. The pain was immediate and excruciating, like fire coursing through her body, but it was enough to break the entity's hold. The shadows recoiled, writhing and screeching, their form fracturing as light burst from the wound, searing them like sunlight on ice. Kasia screamed, her voice merging with the cacophony of the entity's agony. The room erupted in a blinding light, the whispers silenced in an instant. And then, everything went still. Kasia collapsed to the floor, the dagger slipping from her bloodied hand. The dark veins on her arm had begun to fade, their sinister grip loosening. But the entity wasn't gone, not entirely. It lingered, a faint, malevolent presence in the air, waiting for another chance. The curator groaned from across the room, struggling to sit up, his face pale and bloodied. "It's not over," he said weakly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You closed the door, but the crack remains. And it will return." Kasia stared at him, her body trembling, her mind racing. Somewhere deep within, she could still hear it, a faint whisper, a reminder of the darkness that had almost consumed her. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, casting soft beams across the curator's cluttered room. The oppressive chill that had hung in the air was gone, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Kasia lay motionless on the floor, her body aching, her mind a haze of exhaustion and pain. Her bloodied arm throbbed where she had pierced it with the dagger, the faint scar of the black veins still visible beneath her skin. But they no longer moved. The whispers were gone. She sat up slowly, wincing as the stiffness in her muscles reminded her of the night's horrors. The curator leaned against a fallen bookshelf, his face lined with exhaustion, his eyes heavy with grief. Despite his frailty, he managed a weak, knowing smile. "You survived," he said, his voice hoarse. "For now." Kasia's eyes drifted to the dagger, lying on the floor where she had dropped it. Its blade, once gleaming with ethereal light, now appeared dull, lifeless. The symbols etched into its surface no longer shifted, as if the ancient weapon had fulfilled its purpose and fallen silent. "Is it gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The curator hesitated, then shook his head. "It's weakened. You forced it back, severed its hold. But the crack in the door remains. It will always remain." Kasia looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. She could still feel a faint echo of the entity, like a shadow lingering at the edge of her thoughts. Her gaze returned to the curator. "What happens now?" The old man sighed, pulling himself upright with visible effort. "Now, we prepare. The library is not just a sanctuary for knowledge, it is a prison for things that should never have been known." He gestured toward the scattered books and artifacts around them. "There are others like it, bound within the walls. The one you encountered, it was merely the beginning." Kasia's stomach churned at his words, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "How do we stop them?" The curator's expression softened, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "We learn. We guard. And when the time comes, we fight." Kasia stood, her legs unsteady but her resolve growing. She looked around the room, at the fragments of history and the weight of secrets it contained. She had been a junior archivist, content to organize scrolls and preserve the past. Now, she understood the truth, she was a keeper of a fragile balance, a guardian against the ancient forces that sought to unravel it. The first rays of sunlight warmed her face as she opened the shutters, letting the light flood the room. The darkness had retreated, but its memory lingered, a constant reminder of what lay hidden. As she turned back to the curator, the whispers faded completely, leaving only silence. For the first time in hours, Kasia allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't over. But the fight had only just begun.